Hi, welcome to Governance Bites. Today it's my pleasure to spend time with my friend Don Allerston. Thank you, Don, for your time.
Thank you, Mark. Great to be here.
Don is an experienced life insurance executive with experience both in the UK and in New Zealand. So his focus area is really around the customer experience and quite an amazing thinker. So a really great person to have a conversation with. So thank you very much for your time.
That's a privilege. Thanks very much for that kind introduction, buddy. Appreciate it.
Not at all. We've been discussing a little bit about the tension between governance and the need for a business continually innovate and reinvent itself to remain relevant. Can you open our conversation with your thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, Mark. Look, I think it's a terrific question, and I think where I always start, I'm a great fan of context. Mm-hmm. And so let's just examine first of all innovation. So innovation of itself is subject to its own process, and that process itself is subject to the culture of an organization, its own processes, its systems, its protocols, those types of things, appetite to innovation. And then of course all of that is overseen, if I can, by the voice from the top. So we think about the narrative of governance. And typically we speak to pillars of governance which might sit in around things such as culture. It might sit in and around accountability. They might sit around transparency, responsibility, those type of words, typically speaking. So that's very much the context in the micro sense. Mm-hmm. But of course, governance and innovation doesn't exist in a micro context. You've got to think about the world at large. And here we are, we've just traveled through a period which has been described as incomprehensible through frameworks such as VUCA frameworks, and we're now stumbling into the Bani world, where the framework is describing the world as brittle, anxious, non-linear, incomprehensible. So you can understand there that we're moving from this environment of unpredictability. Mm-hmm. through to the chaos of the macro environment and a post-COVID environment. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, you think, my gosh, these challenges, these pushes, these sways, these influence around innovation against that context, it's bound to throw up tension if you accept that innovation itself gives rise to future competitive advantage.
Right, so, and we were also talking before around how the board of directors are in some ways constrained by their liability, their criminal liability, mm-hmm. and so that leads to a degree of conservatism potentially at the board level, and yet the business has this kind of need to continue to innovate and remain relevant. So that tension drives well, as you say, culture is a huge part of this, and it's the difference between kind of short-termism and long-term thinking, right? Because in a short term, being conservative and staying kind of status quo can seem a very safe bet, but in the long term, if you don't innovate, you die, right?
Yeah, look, I think so. I think short-termism versus thinking in the long term. I think that's an argument which is reigned in perpetuity. So in that sense, if you think about it, I'm a great sense of looking at other parallels which describe some of these challenges. And if I use parallels and have a little bit of fun with this, if I think about, I'm a great football fan, and I'm bemused at the number of football clubs that turn over their management and the broader coaching staff, expecting within a jot, within a nanosecond, the culture of an organization, its playing staff, results, etc., deliver an immediate upturn with the change of management, and it just doesn't follow. And so I think you have to look beyond short-termism, and you've got to think around the sustainability of the innovation question in order to keep yourself true and keep yourself honest.
Right, and we're in an environment where you've got boards of directors with terms of 10 to 3 to 4 years, thinking about surviving the end of their term and doing a good job in that term. You've got executives that are often on short-term contracts, or at least with some sort of short 3 to 5 year incentives, and yet you've got companies that are legal persons into perpetuity, and a need for this very long-term thinking, right?
Yeah, no, look, absolutely. I'm also mindful of change in environment and that challenge over time. So if you think, Mark, we were joking the other day when you asked me to sit on this. We were talking about the halcyon days of Madison Avenue back in the 1960s. 15 years after the Second World War, a time of liberation. I look at those halcyon days of the advertising organisations. You know, and at times, if we look back at it now, we look at it at horrendous times. But we talk about, you know, the role of gender, for instance, the benefits of a Lucky Strike cigarette, you know, all of those things which now are an abhorrence. Of course, you couldn't do that now in the interests of driving value into enterprise. Governance has changed markedly. You know, those times predate Enron and Sarbanes-Oxley, for one. We didn't have that. So you can't do that. And so when you think around an organization, particularly its governance framework, it does have to keep an eye on its long term, but it has to recognize the challenges of short-termism as expressed maybe through the demands of shareholders.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yes, shareholders want to return now.
Absolutely.
Or even in a not-for-profit organisation, the members wanting some sort of change now, as you suggested before. You get a new management team in. What are the results now? What's happening now? Yeah, absolutely. What impact does this have then? This need for innovation to remain relevant and for the organisation not to ultimately fail if it doesn't change. What impact does that have on the risk appetite of an organisation, particularly at a governance level? Yeah,
look, Mark, I think that's a terrific question. For me, I think it's the nub of the theme. When we talk about governance, we think about risk, and we think about risk in the context of its relationship to opportunity. And so, for me, I've always found that a fascinating tension. There's that word tension again. And I think around that in the context of this wonderful country that we live in. And just let me play this out if you just give me a minute or two. And that is, imagine you're a retailer, if you will, and you're existing in New Zealand. We talk about this wonderful team of 5 million that we speak to. But if you're a retailer, you have to look at things such as capacity. You've got to look at things such as price. You've got to look at consumption. You've got to look at affordability. So you have to look at your audience, then you have to think about how we're going to make a buck. We live in a capitalist society at the end of the day, so you've still got to make a buck. So in that context, maybe your audience isn't 5 million, maybe your audience is actually only 3 million, 3.5 million. And so in that context, what we're speaking to there is considerations such as market size. So in the context of market size, I think also around when I came to New Zealand and I was educated around this notion of number 8 why, give it a go, the entrepreneurial spirit of your everyday Kiwi, which I think's terrific. But unfortunately, I also think the other side of that is it can take us to oversupply. And in the context of oversupply in a market through that entrepreneurial nature, then actually, are you really helping customers, or are you creating unintended consequences? So if you think about all these organizations that are springing up in support of, I don't know, a particular sector, a particular industry, each of those, for argument's sake, may have a board. We're talking about governance, so let's think about boards. So they may have a board, they'll have a CEO, they'll have an executive team, they'll have the subject matter experts, they'll have licenses, they'll have administration platforms, da-di-da-di-da. That creates a cost base. So in a small market which is oversupplied, you've got real tension around that challenge, because how far actually can you start discounting, or how far can you start thinking about your audience beyond that which you already have? Innovation, of course, being a pathway to access more customers. And of course, that brings with it legacy constraints, and also brings fear, because possibly you're using a certain channel through which you actually sell or you distribute that product. Well, if you start venturing into other channels, does that create tension with the existing channel? Arguments of foul play. You start to upset your existing third party. They tell you where to go. Next thing is you've lost your route to market. So I think absolutely this tension and need to move is such an interesting question, and driven by so many things. Environments, as we've just discussed, being just one of those.
And one of the things you just alluded to there in terms of market size, for some large consumer items, your audience may be 3.5 million, but some of the stuff in the industry that we're dealing with, you might have a potential audience of 9,000, right? So, and when you, as you suggest, if you start getting 4, 5, 6 players in that market, you're really creating a very large cost base across the industry for quite arguably a very small market. And to make that viable, you've either got to win over the competition and survive where they don't, or grow outside New Zealand and go into bigger markets, which has its own challenges, of course, in terms of their own local context.
Well, again, if you think about those dynamics, you're investing so much money into a New Zealand environment, for argument's sake. So there's a question there on your draw on capital, your incomes. That's only going to go so far, given your overhead. So the opportunity to move out of that requires bravery, you might argue, requires an organization to be very clear in the steps it takes to innovate, being very deliberate, to think about possible futures and then to backcast from those futures and think about the delta between where they need to be, these organizations, compared to where they are right now. And then through maybe different evolved governance practices, step their way through those challenges. Because to your earlier point, innovate or die. No one shrunk to greatness, Mark. So you've got to continue to look at that pathway or else be caught up in a legacy which assumes nothing is moving around you, and therefore that's a farce. That's an unacceptable truth, particularly in the interest of shareholders or your capacity to drive future revenue streams, future profit pools.
So I think you've kind of hinted back to the earlier question around this appetite for risk in terms of creating this vision of the future of the entity. You talked about what you need to do to change. I think one of the things that's very important to do is to put status quo up against that and say, what would this business look like in 30 years' time if it didn't change? And then you realise that there's a significant amount of risk in not changing. And it then becomes a question of not should we change, but how do we change?
Yeah, there's quite a bizarre reality in all of this. I'm a great fan of Seth Godin, and Seth Godin talks about the least risky thing to do is to face into risk, and he speaks very much around this notion through his book Purple Cow. It's an old book now. Those people who've worked with me, for me, around me, will know that I'm a great fan of Purple Cow. And the basic tenet is this: is in order to stand out, you need to be a purple cow. You need to be the cow in the farmyard that people are pulling up at the side of the road. Kids are nudging their parents, look at that purple cow, because all else is brown cow, and it's of no interest. But of course, the problem with purple cow is this: if there's a purple cow in every field, that in itself becomes brown cow. And so this notion around moving forward and continuing to think about the future and the opportunity that is caught up through innovation, through new product developments, accessing new markets, those types of things are so important to the future survival of an enterprise. Again, you look at Blue Ocean strategy, again, an older strategy now, but nonetheless, some of the tenets within that are still really, really important, particularly around those notions of the strategy canvas and where you have the opportunity to set yourself aside from the competitors, or else it's a car yard. Each car yard looks the same, is branded the same. Yes. The only variable is price, or who you like. That's an interesting one. Who you like. Do you want to place the business with Mark, or do you want to place the business with Don? Place it with Mark. He's a nicer guy. I don't know. But then it comes down to price. And of course, then we start to circle around.
It's a race to the bottom.
It's a race to the bottom.
Yes, right. And what we're talking about here ultimately is this need for a company or an entity, whatever it may be, to have some form of competitive advantage, and then not to rely over time on that competitive advantage, because you will lose your competitive advantage over time, and you have to create a new competitive advantage to continue to be important.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, so in this governance world, then we've discussed we've kind of I think agreed on the need for an entity to be innovative, to remain relevant. So if you're on a board, or if you're an executive trying to convince the board of this, how do you convince your shareholders, how do you convince your board of the importance of innovating to remain relevant?
Look, I think you mentioned it. I think a board governance has many audiences, and I think the shareholder is an important one. Traditionally speaking, you mentioned non-for-profit. That could be thinking about the member base, but let's just stick for the purposes of our conversation now with something which is more traditional. Let's look at innovation. Innovation is caught up in the balance sheet. Innovation is caught up in the balance sheet in the form of goodwill, brand equity, I would argue. And if we look at those great companies in the past, they're the ones where that share price has continued to grow and move because of the perception of that organization to step into new markets, to develop new products, i.e. latent opportunity to grow and to develop, and therefore to create greater strength in the share price. And of course, shareholders are always interested in dividends, of course. And so to not grow, to think about innovation actually starts to stymie your opportunity to nudge your share price, to look around a sustainable share price for the market in which you're actually operating, for the sector in which you're operating. So it becomes less so a choice, in my view. Innovation is actually the route to, I've mentioned it once already, the route to competitive advantage, the route to sustainable competitive advantage, and in that context, the route to a sustainable future where you are, again, I raised earlier, you're on the pathway to delivering future profit pools,
yes.
Future profits, future opportunity for the organisations you represent.
And perhaps even at a more base level, innovation is the path to survival.
Yeah, look, as I say, you could say that. If you look at the theorists, if you look at, again, the market and the environment that we live in, we've spoken about that Bani framework that we were chatted about earlier on. For me, you don't have a choice. I think where you do have a choice, however, is in how you tiptoe and then you step forward into that future. You can't be naive around that. You have an obligation, you have a legal obligation. Let's remember as well that board members can go to prison. And so they have a responsibility to think about the future of organisations. But to be conservative will be to stymie that growth, and therefore have you really got your shareholders' interests at heart if you're carrying out that situational analysis of the environment within which that particular business works. And if you're not doing that because you're fearful, then the obvious is true.
One of the things that we spoke about when we were chatting earlier was this concept of incrementalism versus innovation, and how that conservatism in the board can lead to incremental change rather than the kind of innovation that we're talking about. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, look, again, this goes back to, again, that pathway for innovation. And so for me, I've often thought about what is the commitment to innovation, the commitment to change, and I'm a big fan of committing to that endeavour, but doing so judiciously, maybe through certain process pathways, maybe traffic lighting and so forth. Test and learn becomes an important consideration in that context. But if you move too slow, you can be accused of being apathetic to your task. Move too fast, we come back to that word naive again. But nonetheless, innovation as a word captures the imagination, doesn't it? And yet, through maybe our structures, we're not talking about innovation. We're not talking about true change. We're not talking about that which can actually deliver value to enterprise. Incrementalism is a less attractive pathway. Is it going to deliver materiality change? Are we doing enough to survive? Are we doing enough through incrementalism that recognizes, yes, the environment is changing and we're monitoring that? Or does incrementalism leave us unsafe because all we do is we just look at what our neighbours are doing and those about us? Oh, that's great. Yet we take our eye off the ball of maybe non-traditional competitors who can rush in, and the next thing is you're turning your lights off.
The environment changes so quickly. If you do incremental change, by the time you've made the change, the environment's already moved. So you can't stay ahead through incremental change. You've got to really innovate.
You've got to innovate, in my view, and commit to that as being a part of your personality of your enterprise.
Absolutely. Cool. Thank you so much. A couple of final questions for you. One, what, as an experienced executive, what's some of the best advice that you've been given around governance or management or that kind of leading change?
Yeah, look, you said you were going to ask this question, and it's puzzled me. And I was thinking about, gosh, what are my answers to that in the context of this question today? So I thought, look, firstly, in a governance setting, I was given the great lesson around good governance, good practice, good process is good business, and I was reminded of that in the late 90s when we started to see particularly the acceleration of governance and its importance and failure in financial services environments, back in the UK. I've held on to that, and I actually think it is the turnkey solution to our futures and to sound futures. I think beyond that, in terms of general lessons, I actually I'm reminded of a very strong woman I worked for, again back in the UK, and she was talking to me around her lessons in leadership, and she spoke to this notion. I'm going to paraphrase now, I'm trying to remember it, Mark, but she spoke to this notion of ideas without context, she said, are either for the naive and the foolish, the bully or the indulgent. And I think what she was getting at there is look, everybody can have an idea. Everybody can have this tactic, this thing which they're very passionate about. But it is no more in the absence of context as an opinion. What's more, it's very difficult to be able to look at those ideas and prioritize them if you don't have context. And I think executives, certainly how I think you've got to put, first of all, the care of the enterprise at the center of your thinking, right, before you actually think of your own personal thoughts on a matter or passions, because it's the health of the organization that comes first.
It also feels very much like the importance of doing your homework. You know, get, as you say, the context, get some data around it, get some good information around it to drive those good decisions.
Yeah.
And I particularly like what you were saying before about the importance of process and governance. I think, you know, if you get a combination of good people around the table and a strong process to follow, you get great results. If you get good people without a strong process, it becomes very haphazard. If you have a good process without good people, then you don't end up with the right thinking.
Look, I think it's great, and Mark, you know, we think about the language of governance we were speaking earlier on, for instance, but also I was thinking, does it require us, if you accept innovation as a part of a future and as a part of the lifeblood of any organization, I started to think around, well, what might be the future language of governance? So maybe the future is around accountability with responsibility. Maybe it's culture. Yes, I think we've got to take citizenship. So how do we become better people? What about responsiveness? Responsiveness becomes a really interesting consideration in all of that, in that sense. And also I would talk about participation. The role of participation, so participation, decision making, and in governance frameworks, being the purview of not just people who think the same, but of a broader reach of people and experiences.
Yeah, great, thank you. So the final question I have for you then is, what advice would you have for somebody who's embarking on a career potentially in governance?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, again, I can only reflect on myself in this context. I'm a pretty passionate person around my topics. I do get into them, and I lose my way sometimes. Such is my passion. But I think what it does deliver is, if you're committed to something, if you're looking for a future in governance, think about your purpose. Think about what's important to you, and look for those organisations that you perceive are closest to your worldview, because you will be at your happiest. You'll feel you'll be able to contribute your best. That's, by the way, not joining groupthink. That might be organisations themselves are looking to change, but are looking to change in light of those things that are important to you. Because if you don't do that, I can't help thinking that you won't give of your best. If you're joining an organisation for the sake of it, you'll deliver tier 2 outcomes both for yourself and for those that you're supposed to be representing. That's maybe what I would say.
That's great advice. Find something you're really passionate about to get involved in, so you can really give your best to it.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Don, for your time. It's been a great conversation.
Perfect.
Look forward to our next catch up, and
awesome.
I'll see you next episode.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers, Mark.
Cheers, Mark.